Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first of two panels about being Black in game audio. Despite a public commitment to diversity, Black talent continues to be severely underrepresented in a disproportionately white game audio industry. In this panel, we'll hear from Black composers about their experiences, problems, and thoughts on creating an empathetic and inclusive industry. First, I'd like to thank Renee Giddens, the IGDA, the Interactive Audio Special Interest Group, and the Black In Games Special Interest Group for their support. This panel wouldn't be possible without them. So without further ado, let's get to know our guests. So Wilbert Roget II. Will Roget is a veteran composer in the video game industry, scoring Mortal Kombat 11, Call of Duty World War II, the Emmy Award-winning Star Wars, Vader Immortal, Guild Wars 2, Path of Fire, Lara Croft and the Temple of Osiris, Destiny 2, Forsaken, Anew, The Distant Light, and other indie and AAA titles. Let me take a breath here, because that was very long, long list of credits, right? Chase Bethea is a composer who has been working professionally in the industry for 9 years with many indie studios and some AAA studios. Jasmine Cooper, who is a multimedia composer whose experience primarily rests in the video game community. She currently resides in Vietnam, where she teaches English and composes part-time. Hassan DuRant is a freelance composer for games and media and is also a writer. My name is Xiao An, and I'll be moderating this panel. So all the guests' websites will be linked in the description, so please check out their work. Right now, so let's get into some of these questions. And some of these are a little lighter and some of these are pretty heavy. So everyone sort of just answer to where you feel comfortable answering. So the first topic we're going to cover is networking while Black, right? So straight into the question, what are routine networking while Black experiences that you feel game audio folks should be more aware of? Just let me know if you want to, you can just jump in.
I guess for me, majority of my network experience has been online, but I know before I came to Vietnam, I wanted to make it my point to be able to put a face with the name. So make sure I put myself out there so that people recognize who I am. And I guess it's just being, I guess if the question is, what should you be aware of as someone who is a Black game composer who's networking? I guess just understand that the game audio industry is working on being inclusive. And so it's more of feeling like an oddity in a space where there aren't many people there like you. But don't let that be a deterrent. But it is just something else that we have to work through, just going into a space and understanding that there aren't going to be many of us. So, just understand that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're in a situation where there's not only not many of us in total, but especially not in like senior or leadership positions. I mean, I honestly can't think of a single non-white audio lead or director, and only like a small handful of non-male ones. And the quote I always use is that the brain is the laziest organ in the human body. It's constantly looking for shortcuts. And sometimes, unfortunately, that search for shortcuts leads to stereotypes and eventually perhaps prejudice. And so there's a tendency to walk in a room, you're at some gathering, and you're going to look for someone who looks like they might be senior, which inevitably is going to be a tall white male in his early 30s to late 40s, who's, most likely just projects that sort of I am the leader kind of vibe. And unfortunately, that then means that everyone else who doesn't really quite fit in the mold, we kind of get excluded, not through the fault of anyone, really. It's pretty much almost never intentional, but it's just this sort of constantly reinforced stereotyping, I guess. And it becomes very difficult to be taken seriously. Especially if your style or what you're trying to do as an artist is completely going against whatever stereotypes people might have about, well, this is how a Black musician should sound. This is how, whatever should sound. it can be very difficult to sort of short circuit the stereotypes that people will be launching at you.
Mm-hmm. Chase and Hassan?
So yeah, I would, just to kind of add on to that, stereotypes are a really, really heavy thing to embody with the burden of a mental state that you have, that you face every day. And so I can only speak from my experiences, but I tried my best to combat that by acting like I belong. And what I mean by that is I do my absolute best to not take it personal, even though internally that's all you probably want to do as a human being, but I don't let it sway me. So I stay as friendly as I can with certain people if I'm at a networking event, and if they ignore me, then I acknowledge that I'm being ignored, and maybe if that event per se is not the one, I leave. And I have to learn to be comfortable with leaving, understanding that maybe not that event was there for me to be at that for that time, but I showed up and I made my presence known, which I think is the bigger picture to remember, is that you do have to show up, even though you may feel underrepresented in whatever the room that you're in. But acknowledging that doesn't make you the minority, it makes you part of the bigger goal.
Yeah, well said. One of the things that I've run into actually relates to a whole bunch of different fields. This isn't obviously the only one that this happens in, but just multiple studies showing that people in positions of power, so for example, at graduate schools, the graduate faculty are less likely to respond to messages from prospective students who aren't white and who aren't men. And that sort of, even though it's an implicit bias sort of thing, it does prevent people from being able to make the connections that a lot of other people have access to. And that's something that definitely has happened in games as well.
Yeah, you know, like to sort of, I'm sorry, I don't mean to jump in, but like,
go on.
One of the things, so part of the reason why I've never really spoken up about things like this is that I really like to be solution oriented. And so Chase, I really love your answer, because it's such an important thing to be present, to keep showing up, you know, year after year. GDC, I've also gone like every single year since 2006, being a constant presence, and not seeming like, you know, just like a fly by night or operation is super important for legitimizing yourself. And the other technique that I like to use is what's called the elevator pitch, which is where you can summarize. It's a I don't know, marketing term or just a business term, but basically it means you should be able to summarize your own career in like 1 or 2 sentences. Literally this time it takes to ride an elevator up a couple of floors. You should be able to quickly explain what it is you do. And in that explanation, give yourself some sort of a memorable, unique vibe or something like that, so that people remember who you are. And I found that having that elevator pitch, perhaps with a tinge of the most subtle of humble brags, having that elevator pitch short circuits. It just short circuits whatever stereotypes that you can see in people's faces that their brains are just loading up for you. They're trying to use that to take that shortcut, and you short circuit it immediately. And now they have to treat you as an individual, just like they've been treating everyone else.
Ooh, and if you don't mind me jumping in as well, if you're going to a networking activity, I would also say if you know what you're going there for, or you have a goal, that also really helps. Rather than, I mean, I understand going there just to be, but if you know, I want to go to this networking event to talk to these particular people, you know, that gives you time to actually read up and gain information. So that way, when you go and you actually talk to that person, any stereotype that they might have about you is completely melted away, because you come saying, hey, I know you write for this. And, you know, it gives you the opportunity to go ahead and unload the knowledge that you have pertaining to that game or that company that you're interested in. So that if there were any doubts, it's eroded away, because you come with knowledge that you had time to acquire before you even go to the networking event. So doing your homework before you show up also helps too.
Yeah. It's
So I
fantastic.
mean, this is great. I mean, there are a lot of great takeaways, like disrupting expectations, and and just doing the work all the time, even though it must be such a difficult thing to do. So let's move on to a different question that's slightly adjacent to this. Will, we were having a short conversation about this earlier regarding a term called culture fit. And a lot of teams use culture fit as sort of a requirement for working in-house. And people generally don't think too much about this. Like you said, a lot of this is unintentional, right? But the meaning can be insidiously exclusionary for both employees and contractors, and especially among those who are entry level. Do you have any thoughts on this, and the underlying philosophy presents an obstacle?
Yeah, I'm about to be rather critical, and I apologize in advance. I love this industry so much, and I don't mean to ruffle feathers or whatever, but I will say that there is this concept called the culture fit, which, as you said, very loosely defined. And I would say that this concept is one of the biggest contributors to all kinds of bigotry with regards to race, gender, and ageism as well in the game industry. And my take on it is that, when you're working on any video games are ridiculously hard to make. I mean, preposterously hard. They take insanely dedicated and crazy talented, crazy brilliant people, and lots of them, to make anything. And I know for a fact that game dev teams across every discipline have famously difficult dev cycles, especially nowadays, with constant threats of crunch time, extended hours, just always looming over everyone's head, no matter how much planning you do, right? And so in addition to that, there's lots of work which is maybe not so appealing. Someone's got to tag 1 million footsteps. Someone's got to do all of these, dialogue, all kinds of things that when you're the bright-eyed, bushy-tailed person who's just starting off in the industry, you maybe wouldn't have thought that would be your job right away. But the thing is, lots of times entry-level audio designers are hired to cover those things and to put in the crazy hours doing them. And the assumption is that they should be able to be asked to do any task and spend any amount of time, overtime working on them with a smile and just happy to do it. And I think this is where the concept of the culture fit actually grows out of. I think that teams are seeking fresh blood to give off the impression that they'll be happy with these very sort of unwanted conditions, but they'll be okay with it and they'll have a positive experience in spite of it. But unfortunately, this also unintentionally can result in people hiring other people that look like them or that talk like them or with similar hobbies or interests, but are younger and single. It's more like, it's hard to boss around a stranger, but it's very easy to boss around like your little brother. And this is long before even considering the, more inflammatory elements like wanting to be able to make any joke they want or get away with offensive language or anything like that. This is just feeling comfortable ordering around someone who's just starting in the industry. And I think that's kind of like a bigger problem even than race. But it is something that I'm pretty sure is behind what a lot of what we're talking about is coming from in terms of in-house positions.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's extremely detailed, and thank you for that. We're going to actually another thing that was Will who brought this up at some point, but this is a question for everyone, a little bit about activism burnout. So when the recent protests began, right, and everything started trending on social media, I think in the little chat group that we have, some of you mentioned that organizations suddenly started offering gigs, at this time, coincidence? Possibly not. So what are your thoughts on activism burnout, where organizations use partnerships with Black people and Black talent for the optics, and then once the media moves on to something else, they kind of forget about that thing they were suddenly so committed about? And how can they do better?
For me, it's extremely frustrating. It's extremely frustrating. I've I've been seeing on Twitter people saying, "Hey, if you're Black, come here." And I'm just like, no, no. Like I was doing some research, and I mean, I'm just looking back at composers who were having this issue in Hollywood in the 50s and 60s. Like it's the same problem now. It's just transferred itself over into another budding industry. It's nothing new, but I just feel as though the train's going. Everybody heard the whistle, and they're like, "Hey, let's hop on it and see if we can grab a few people while it's running." And so I do. I was talking to my mom about it, and my mom, she sees it as, I understand it seems really weird, but like if you get an opportunity, you should try and take it. But for me, I'm extremely conflicted with it because I'm also surrounded by people who have been very active in the community as long as I've been in here. And they've been active the whole time, trying to make pathways for people who have limited voices. And so it's hard to see people who have been doing that when the world and the community have been silent. And then to be thankful for people who suddenly just sprout up when it feels very opportunistic to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll be vulnerable and I'll tell you, like, I had a breakdown about it because we were on a platform similar to what was called like the Guerrilla Collective a couple weeks ago. And it was just more of like, why now? Like, I'm not surprised, but it should have been happening a long time ago. And it would have been easier if, personally, I think some people just lack focus and consistency, those two things. And if the goals are supposed to be sustained, they would be sustained, but it's easily passed off onto what terms as priority. And so this is like priority now, but what's going on in the media right now, right? In our industry, a lot of other things are happening. What's happening in between that? Where's the focus? Are we still on this? Are we still going to be continuing this? Is this conversation that we're only going to have, today on June 23rd, 2020? Or is there going to be more? So the consistency needs to continue here forward in order for that to kind of be changed overall in the magnitude that we are seeking that. And the inclusivity of it should just be natural. Honestly, I think, in my opinion, I shouldn't be having breakdowns for this. I shouldn't be conflicted to be on the hype train. I shouldn't have these experiences at this time, but I am. And so now, yes, we're talking about it. Let's talk about it. Keep the focus, keep the consistency, and don't lose it. Just embody and embrace the rock in front of you, and let's work and move the boulder together.
Going off of that, I think part of the burnout comes about because, quite frankly, a lot of the people who are making hiring decisions don't have friends that don't look like them and don't hire people who have friends who look like them. So to be direct, I think a lot of this burnout can be avoided if you just had those friends. Like if you were to ask me for recommendations for something, I would naturally give you recommendations from women, from Black and brown people, and that's just because those are who I know. Whereas I feel like it's difficult for people to have to search for these people if they don't know them. So like months from now, when things have calmed down, it's harder to keep that focus because it's just not who you actually know. And so I don't know how to enforce that, but like just making actual friends, not just work friends, like that would go a long way if people actually did that.
Yeah, and from the perspective of again, most of my experience is not so much on the indie side, but more of like the corporate, I guess, however you want to call it. And one thing that some companies have been doing is that they have been doing certain forms of outreach, which I greatly encourage. I know that like Sledgehammer, for instance, their recruiters have gone to the Facebook group Black in Gaming. It's a great resource, and they've used that to try to get applicants for some of their new positions that have opened up. There's also organizations like Girls Who Code, Black Girls Code, and the Game Devs of Color Expo, which are, again, great resources and great things. If you want to make a donation, then you can to Girls Who Code and Black Codes Code. And then even those organizations in particular also produce a number of alumni who you can, that's a feather in their cap that they went through that program. Maybe it's not exactly an audio thing, but just in general, like these are proactive measures that can be taken. I also read that EA has done a very interesting thing. So in addition to making donations, EA has also created this program where I think like one day of the year, everyone in all of EA, all 70,000 employees or however many they have, gets a volunteer day. So it's a full paid day, but they are encouraged to volunteer in their communities. And I did some like quick math real quickly, and I realized that that's over $1 million every single year, hopefully in perpetuity. That, when you think about like employee hours and salaries and whatnot, that they're basically dedicating towards let people help out their communities, which is fantastic. And I think it's a great first step. Reaching out to historically Black colleges would be another great idea for people who are coming from a recruitment standpoint. But yeah, just like you said, having friends across all races is completely invaluable tool. I know that Twitter has the Black Game Devs handle. I've noticed that it seems to be mostly people on the art and animation side, but it's still, for anyone who's interested, there's incredible talent. I'm blown away like almost every single day by some of the things that I see there. It's just I'm pretty sure it's just hashtag Black Game Devs. And then there's also like an actual Twitter, what do you call it when it's not a person, but organization, whatever, like at
animal.
And it's been so encouraging and so great to see so much talent out there.
That's great. These are all great answers, and I'd like to move on to something slightly related. We're talking about having friends, right, from everywhere, different races, different genders, and one of the issues, right, in the United States, obviously, is that a lot of neighborhoods are sort of predominantly one ethnicity or another, and this sort of greatly affects things like public school funding and the attention of the police, for example. And because of these issues, I mean, obviously different communities, and specifically here, Black people would be facing very unique challenges in trying to pursue this specific career, which as we all know, requires money to get the gear that you need to even begin to sound professional, right? Mm-hmm. So there are two parts to this question. One is, what do you think are some of the unique difficulties faced by Black people in pursuing a game audio career, right, from the perspective of education, gear, attending events, that sort of thing, right, unpaid internships as well, right? And well, why don't we start with that? What are the specific disadvantages that people may not have at the forefront of their minds?
I taught music back in the U.S. before I came to Vietnam, and I was split between two schools. It was interesting seeing the demographic between my two schools because they were 5 miles apart from each other. So I had one school that was predominantly Black and Hispanic, and when I first got to this middle school, I had to basically have people donate instruments to me because we had like one saxophone, maybe 2 trumpets, maybe a trombone, or maybe 3 trombones. But of those trombones, 3 trombones, 1 worked. And so for this school, I had to donate. And when I actually had students in the class, I had to have students. Let's say I had a clarinet section. I had 5 clarinet players. I had to have 5 clarinet players in 6th grade, 4 in 7th, and let's say 3 in 8th grade. I had 10 clarinet students sharing 3 clarinets. And then I go down the road to my other school where about at least 60% of my students could afford to actually get their own instrument. And this is just in the distance of 5 miles, a 10-minute drive, the disparity between these two schools. And so I would definitely say one is just, I would say, of having the financial capacity to be able to afford having a child who's interested in music. But I think more importantly than that, it's being able to convince parents that there's worth in music. Because when you grow up in, not, and this isn't like all Black people do not grow up poor, but if you're from a community where, if you come from a community where you struggled financially, or you come from a family that hasn't struggled financially, but previous generations have, and so there's a focus on making sure you have a job that guarantees that you continue to have this affluency that your parents had, then having a job in music doesn't seem viable, right? Like, you grew up in poverty, this is another job that could keep you in poverty, so why would you do it? Or you come from a family that's affluent, why would you want to have a job that wouldn't continue to lead a legacy of affluency? So I feel like it really starts more with a mindset and also exposure, because I mean, a lot of my students, 6th grade, had no idea who a composer was. But then you go to other schools and kids know who a composer is in 3rd grade. But I have students, who are preparing themselves for high school and who don't have the basic music vernacular to understand who writes music or who creates it. So I would say one of the biggest problems that I've seen in the communities that I've educated is just the mindset to understand that music is a financial way of paving a life for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was a super good answer. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's okay. Did anyone want to jump in quickly, or should I move on to the second part of the question?
I just wanted to mention that what Jasmine mentioned is so universal, and it's something that I think is rather, I mean, you might even almost just say that it's unfair for the entirety of audio. If you're just starting out, do you have any idea how much we spend on gear just
oh my gosh
start out?
Oh my gosh. And not even hardware. Not even hardware.
Oh yeah, like the hardware, the software, the sample libraries, it's preposterous. Everyone needs their own gear and all their own software, and it's extremely expensive. And even when you're just working on your first demo for an internship or an entry-level position, you're going to need all of this stuff to be competitive. And if someone is just simply wealthier than you, or maybe they come from a wealthier family or generational or whatever, they have a huge advantage. I mean, it's just night and day. And like Jasmine mentioned, not every Black person grows up poor, of course, but race and economics are extremely closely tied in the United States. I think it's tough to quantify this, but they have proven that basically race is a greater predictor of wealth even than education. And so when you demand that everyone in this field, even when they're just starting out, has to have already made this crazy high investment, it's really not that big of a surprise that it can very easily end up being quite monochromatic. And so, and also, like we've been saying, there's a tendency to gravitate towards hiring your acquaintances and friends, which can just result in a very homogenous experience, homogenous workplace. I apologize if this person is watching. I've completely forgotten his exactly who it was, but we had a panel in Seattle a couple of years ago, maybe, about diversity in game audio. And he suggested, why is it that we require demos for entry-level positions in audio? Who's to say that someone might be out there who has great ears, who is a great worker, can learn very quickly, but maybe they just don't have the equipment or the gear, or maybe they can't afford it, or they can't make that investment just yet. And these are the kinds of questions that I hope that game studios can start to ask, is, maybe we can rethink how we've been doing hiring and how we've been basically forcing people right out of the gate to spend ludicrous amounts of money just to get in. It's not like this in any other department. At most, maybe you might need a really, really nice graphics card and a really nice for an art team, but that's just about it.
Yeah, I want to actually touch on something that Jasmine said, which is a word called exposure. And that's a really big word to consider in this situation because, like you were saying, Jasmine, exposure allows awareness, cognizance. And if the children are not exposed to these things, they don't know it exists. And so what I've been kind of doing is segueing and guest speaking at different colleges and moving to different schools and things like that to, again, show up and be present, to be seen as like, hey, I'm a composer. I specialize in composing video games, but I'm a composer and this is what I've done. And sometimes you got to do the reach out because we're not being seeked out. Because why? The exposure, the visibility. So if I don't have it, I have to seek the exposure that I want to give the exposure for. And the exposure that happens from that expands. And so then you learn about all the things that all the resources that I've gathered, whereas in like, hey, you got a composer contest, you can win these Spitfire libraries. Hey, you've got these channels where GDC will give you a pass if you sign up for this scholarship. Hey, these people are doing this. Hey, these people are doing that. But there's a miscommunication happening, probably from one of being seeked out and one that you have to seek out for that maybe you're getting gatekeeped for, right? Like maybe they don't allow you to speak because they don't want to have that exposure for them. And so there's no one on the inside to make that bridge and that connection. So from my experience, part of my life, I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I went to a fine arts option school. My parents bought me an alto saxophone. I was in choir. I was in band. That was my exposure to music. But if I didn't go to that fine arts option school and I didn't have that experience, I mean, my parents were also a singer and things of that nature too. I probably would have found my way. I was still involved with music somehow. But there are certain things of resources that come along with that. And if that child doesn't have that because they're not thinking about it, we're not pulling these guest speakers in, people like us on this panel, where is the education happening? Like there's a missing link because there aren't enough videos. When I started out, I started doing my own videos on YouTube. I put myself out there to say, hey, I'm here. I exist. And then it started to happen where I was getting institutions to say like, oh, well, we want to have you come in and talk about this and talk about that. And then I realized, but I had to put that exposure out there, right? So with that comes the education for me to give the resources out there too, because I guess what I had to learn is not everybody thinks the same. If we all did, it'd be probably boring. So I'm glad we don't. But with that being said, knowledge is power, but applied knowledge is greater power. And with that applied knowledge that you can do along with everything will embody and it would just enhance the experience for people to have these type of resources available to them for those who are not as fortunate.
Right. No, absolutely, Chase. I mean, I think that's a really great point. Just having kids be exposed to this stuff, and also you getting your face out there as a Black composer. I mean, a Black kid is gonna see that, and they're interested in music, and they're gonna think that they can do this too. And this is something we've spoken. I mean, I guess we've spoken about a lot of things, but at Game Sound Con, we were talking about how just kind of, it's just kind of being able to see that someone's out there doing it and being successful. That's also going to kind of change some of the mental barriers in coming to the industry. And speaking about those resources and the exposure and all that, right? I mean, obviously, not everyone is privy to this information, right? Or maybe they haven't sought it out. So I'm sure every one of you has been given advice at some point by someone well-meaning, and that doesn't necessarily take into context the specific struggles based on identities. So, would you be comfortable sort of maybe sharing examples as specific as you like or as non-specific as you like, of kind of advice well-meaning advice you receive from composers in the industry, that don't take into account the context of the struggle and specific difficulties faced by Black people in this industry?
I have something.
Yes.
So, yeah, just in thinking about advice that I was given probably late high school as I was like contemplating different sorts of careers that I might want to go through. Common advice that I would hear is to tap into your network or your parents' network to like find people at certain companies or just people who have more experience in whatever you're trying to do. And at my high school, so I went to a magnet school, and it wasn't my neighborhood school. I just was able to go there because I spoke French and there was a program for that. But anyway, it was definitely if it was your neighborhood school, you were pretty much rich. And common advice that I would hear just around the hallways, or just with people helping out, would be like, oh, I'll ask my mom to ask around the country club or at church. And like, my parents don't know those people. And to put things in perspective, at that school, while I was there in junior year, the neighborhood found that they still had a clause in their charter stating that Black people can't live in that neighborhood. Obviously in 2009 or 10, like nobody would publicly try and prevent Black people from living there. But like absolutely, when my mom was growing up, that would have been enforced. And like if she had wanted to, or if her mom had wanted to buy a house in that area, she wouldn't have been able to. But if she had, I would have probably known a bunch of those people. And so it's just things like that it's nobody's fault today, but it's still something that we have to deal with today.
Mm-hmm.
See,
Man, that's insane.
yeah, that's pretty bad.
That's pretty horrible. I had one thing happen, but it wasn't in regards to my race, but it was in regards to my gender. I remember someone mentioned, hey, you get more gigs if you presented yourself as a sexy gamer girl composer. And I was like,
Oh,
I was like, no thanks, man, but I'll take it into consideration. I was like, okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
Isn't that so tricky that when people make these kinds of awful comments, it's almost like now it's your responsibility to make this situation less awkward, and you can actually feel the years shaving off the end of your life every time that you have to, someone makes some horrible 3/5 joke or something, and you're just like, I can't believe you said that. That's awful. But I can't call you out on it because now I'm the bad guy, and it's you can just see the years shaving off.
I don't know. I'm at a point now where if you say something ignorant, I'm just gonna make you feel awkward. I don't care anymore.
As you should.
It's 2020. We have people. You should know better.
Wow, that's really bad advice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I tried it, but it didn't work. So I'm just a joke. I didn't try.
Yeah. So, Chase and Will, I mean, like, if there's nothing, that's okay. We can move on. But I'm just wondering if either of you have been provided with any sort of insensitive advice for any particular reason.
Yeah,
Go ahead, sure.
Okay. Saran, you had posted something on your Facebook page, and all your posts are great, by the way. But this one in particular, it struck a tone with me. So it's the "be so good they can't ignore you," right? That one. But they still can ignore you, and that's just the facts. And they can, and they will still ignore you. And my small example was like, I put myself out there. I introduced myself as like, I'm a composer, but someone else wants to introduce him like, hey, this is Chase Bethea. He's a sound designer and audio engineer and all this other stuff. And I was like, I didn't say any of that, or you've just kind of made that up in your head and you're introduced to something different. And now, like, we were talking about the awkwardness, whereas in you've got to maybe correct them. And yeah, the gears are shaving off like slowly, like shaving ice, but it's like, well, do you correct them? Is this political right click thing to do? It's professional. And then you just kind of like, okay, well, how do they ignored you, right? Like you have demos, you have things set up, but they still aren't paying attention. And what I was thinking was someone that you can put your videos out there and you show all this great music work that you did in your implementation, get like a few likes on your social media or anything, or retweets, and maybe some comments, and that's it. But someone else does the exact same thing that you do, and the thing goes viral. So that's what I'm saying is, like, you could be so good, we can have all this audio gear to start out or to be at a veteran state and things like that, but they can still ignore you. So what does that advice mean? What is it? It doesn't have any weight.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's like something that I've done basically my whole life. Like the only way to get around these sorts of biases is to literally be the best wherever you are. And that's basically the only reason why I've had the limited amount of success in various areas I have, is because I'm stressed out about like being the absolute best so that nobody can ignore you. But at a point that does like run out, like once you get like further into the real world, there's like hundreds of thousands of other people. So it's like much more difficult to be the best out of hundreds of thousands of people.
And that gets frustrating. That's taxing, because you have to be the best to rise above mediocrity. And then when you get into a room of the best, you're like, but I have to be the best of the best in the room of the best. Like at that point, it's like, how much higher can you go? And it's also having that constant stress of feeling as though I have to work 10 times harder than all these people in here to be recognized. And so when people are already working 10 times harder already, and you're already at max capacity because you've been overworking yourself for as long as you have, at one point, when do you burn out? Right? Because you've been essentially, it feels like you've been working hard and harder the whole time, and you never have a chance to just work for yourself versus working for other people. And I feel like that's draining as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think one thing that's left out of all this advice is usually that it's one person that pulls you up. There is one person that decides to give you a job, and you can be good, but that part still needs to happen. So it's not really mentioned. So we're going to sort of, this is a little bit lighter in tone, but feel free to kind of get dark on me. It's okay.
Pun intended?
Oh no! Well, no, I walked into that one. Well, it's not your job to make me feel comfortable. So, so let's talk about the diversification of musical inspiration in games, right? I mean, because we're seeing a lot of orchestral scores, right? And generally, those tend to be the ones that, for some reason, receive the greatest amount of long-lasting publicity and the greatest PR campaigns. And it's sort of seen like the orchestra is this ultimate goal. I mean, like every composer, almost every composer would love to work with an orchestra one day, right? It's kind of like a goal. That's the hype. So, based on that backdrop, I mean, what do you think about sort of the landscape or soundscape, of music in games nowadays? And, what sort of diversification would you like to see? What do you think could be done better on that front?
One thing I'm thinking about in terms of diversification is I'd like to actually read more about people of culture in some game audiobooks. I mean, it was non-existent to me, if any. I mean, I started in like around 2009, and I have the complete guide to game audio by Aaron Marks, and he references Daryl Duncan and Mike Brassel. But I learned about them in 2011. That book's been around since 95. I learned about you in 2012 through LinkedIn. So before I knew you were at LucasArts. That was it. There's so many game audio books out there right now. It's like you can just stack them up and have them as like wall panels for your absorption at this point. But I would like to see that happen and for it to be more out there. Again, the exposure thing. That's something I would like to at least see.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I might have a different perspective on this than usual. I wouldn't necessarily say that the orchestra is like even really all that hip right now, for a number of reasons. This is a whole other conversation, but I will say that if you were to isolate one musical entity that is as Eurocentric as it possibly gets, it would probably be the orchestra, wouldn't it? I mean, it's about as Western European as you can possibly get. So it might not be a coincidence that that's sort of what's dominated music for media. But that said, I do think that nowadays we're seeing a great expansion beyond the orchestra. I would say that like the orchestra being the height of its popularity and it's like, this is the gold standard or whatever. I would almost say that was more of like a PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3 era thing. Whereas nowadays we're looking for more subversive, more interesting, well, I don't want to say interesting, but like different sources. The PS3 era brought so many indie titles, which had all kinds of different musical styles and genres and arrangements throughout. And then with that, I think the PS4 era now, even in the blockbuster titles, is embracing lots of world instruments, lots of modern sounds, lots of like genre scores, and all sorts of different things that are coming to the forefront. And the orchestra might be a backdrop, it might not. There's lots of scores that just don't even bother with orchestral music, but instead it's really trying to push these diverse backgrounds. So I don't necessarily see that as evidence of a racial inclusion, but I mean, you got to think, not only is the orchestra such a Western European cultural item, but it's also just about the most expensive possible way that you can make music. And like we said, race and economics are so closely intertwined in America, especially, that to demand that like every composer who wants to be taken seriously must write for the orchestra, and that's the only thing we're going to review. I'm
so tired of that.
It doesn't make any sense. I obviously do quite a lot of orchestral scoring, but it doesn't make sense that that's what's seen as like the gold standard of composition. And I think thankfully we're seeing quite an aggressive branching off from that mentality. I mean, you just look at this panel. We've got like so much talent here, and it's so diverse. Everyone on this panel does very, very different stuff. Some things that I really, really admire. And Hassan, I wasn't familiar with your music before, but I checked out your demo reel. It is fantastic. I encourage everyone to go listen to that. It's such amazing. He actually does, quite a wide range of different styles, but all with the highest production value. And Chase and Jasmine, I've always been a huge fan of how both of y'all have this tendency to like mix different eras of game music. So much, just a fly attacking me, but you can hear so much history, even in just like a single piece. You can hear all of these different eras coming together, but in a very modern context. And I think that in this coming generation, we're going to see a lot more of that, a lot more of just embracing different outlets and not just focusing only on this one very specific genre and idiom.
That's really hopeful.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds great. Well, I mean, not for me. I write orchestral music, but actually, Hassan, just kind of going off like the whole diversification thing. I mean, I saw you write something recently on Twitter, as one does, about how the term ethnic music is used, and you weren't for it. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about that.
Yeah, no, it's just something that I see a lot in the way people describe music, and then also the words that we attach to like sample libraries, and when people are giving feedback on music. Just the term ethnic as just this very vague thing that doesn't really, it literally doesn't mean anything, but like, what they mean.
Yeah, it means something. We know what it means.
But basically, I was making the point that if you are going to describe something as ethnic, you can definitely be a lot more specific, because every instrument has some kind of ethnic identity. except for at this point, probably the orchestra, because it has just dominated like literally every part of the world. But there are ethnic Irish instruments, there are ethnic Brazilian instruments, ethnic instruments from China. And like, if you just ask for ethnic and I'm in a really petty mood, maybe I'll just use bagpipes, who knows?
That'd be funny, that'd be great though.
You must do that, and you must tell us about it. So now that we're sort of like coming toward the end, right? I'd like to sort of move this, you know, as Will was saying earlier, to sort of like a solutions-oriented, approach, right? Because at the best of times, this industry is horrifically difficult to get started in, to move up, and then when you've moved up, to keep your spot, right? So everyone's having a hard time, and there are many marginalized groups, right? And so often it's not unheard of that marginalized groups are often, played against each other. It's like there is some kind of like, because resources are limited and that sort of thing. So do any of you have thoughts on framing solutions inclusively, so that we can all sort of be united in pursuing equality in this industry?
I feel like we were talking about it earlier in the terms of diversifying or making friends with people that aren't like you. And I feel as though the first step, I was talking to my mom about this, and we were saying how when you grow up with people that are like you, it makes sense to want to grow up with people who make you feel comfortable. And if you aren't what is seen as what you're used to seeing, you don't bring a sense of comfort because you don't assume that you like the same thing. So I just assume one solution is basically having organizations for people who, quote unquote, may not feel comfortable. It's an easy place for you to go to find people who aren't like you. So if you do want to work on diversifying your network or knowing about other people who are in the same field as you, but you don't lack honestly, I would say you don't lack the drive to diversify yourself, but you just want an easy way to go and find other people. Having spaces like black artists or composers in games or film. It's a hub where you can go to find other people. Because making people diversify their network, like how do you do that? I feel like people who are willing to find others who aren't like them are people who aren't afraid to intermingle and learn about people who they feel may be different from them. And I feel like a lot of people aren't open to that or willing to put themselves in that position. So having places for people to go to find others who aren't from their social circle would be the first step. And then just having people create organizations for others to go and have a place to reach out, I feel would be one thing that we could do.
So like networking with a specific purpose of having diverse individuals come together.
I don't like the sound of that. It's like, hey, we need a black person in here, so let's go to the blacks here. And so, but I guess that's like, it feels like affirmative action, but I feel like if you don't grow up in a space or you're not used to diversity, I feel like the only way to make people diversify themselves is to force it on them. And if you don't want it forced upon you, the only way to have people work on being inclusionary is to just have a space where they can go. I can't really think of any other way to have people work on diversifying their network of their own choice, aside from giving them resources, other than just saying, hey, you gotta have 2 Asian people and 2 Black people on your game team for us to give you funding, right?
I've been thinking about that sort of thing a lot, and I think we see it in a lot of different areas. These sort of small, non-committal but well-meaning gestures never really change anything. It hasn't helped climate change. It hasn't helped with police violence. It hasn't helped anything. So like anything that you do want to do to actually affect change it's probably going to need to seem to be overboard. Not to get too political, but like if we had treated the pandemic that way, things would have been a lot different. But people are afraid of making big commitments for a sustained amount of time. And I feel like that's the only way we don't have to have this panel again in 10 years.
And that's a really good point, because, you know, people will make these little gestures like having a chief diversity officer, you know, or something like that. And then when it comes to like actually putting a lot of money in, right, for an extended period of time to change the balance, right, like you're saying, I mean, it's not going to work unless we make a big gesture, like a really big one. Yeah. So Chase, what do you think?
I think people just need to take the risk and go for it. I think there's a lot of hesitant and resistance going on, and no one wants to take the risk. There's some kind of fear going on, and you can't be inclusive without taking a risk at something. We all took a risk to do game audio. We love it. There are things that go along with that. There's territories, but we take the risk every day to continue to persevere and go on. But no one takes the risk. Well, I wouldn't say no one, but it's not enough risk taking happening to be asked to collaborate, to be sought out, to be invited, to be acknowledged. And it's not consistent. So once you take that risk, it's not one time. You're gonna have to take the risk a lot of times. But I think once they finally take the risk, sure, you're gonna have some things that are gonna happen in between. But that's part of knowing about people. That's part of building relationships. And it won't seem like much of a risk because of proven records and the consistency and the hard work that's been reciprocated and paramount and lifting and growing every time within those individuals. Like you were saying, like everyone on this panel, everyone on the future panel, these people have been consistent. If you take these risks on the people that you show up, the people that are there, the people who are putting it forward all the time, 200,000%, whatever arbitrary number you want, then you'll see that those risks are not the you'll see that's the magnitude I feel. You'll see that these risks aren't so much risk, but valued relationships that you've built in a friend over time, right? And then it becomes looking at it from that perspective of like friendship, which it should be initially, but the fear of taking the risk and not including us, or asking us to submit to awards or things, or actually choosing the awards to be shown in an example. I mean, no one knows us anything, but we can't be involved. We can't be included if we're not asked, we're not invited over and over again. I'll give you one last example. When I was growing up, I had moved to California, and I was kind of inside, and I was wondering like why I wasn't getting invited to such. And I was like, well, maybe I didn't put myself out there to say, hey, like if you see something, invite me. And then all of a sudden I went from not being invited to being invited all the time, whereas it's like, I got to say no to some things I don't really know. But I was happy because even though I probably would say no, they asked again. They asked again. They ask again. Those are the people that believe in you. And that's what I want to see more of. And I feel like is the best solution that could possibly be there.
It's great. And well, on that uplifting note, we have come to the end of the hour. And I'd just like to once again thank Renee very much for letting us have this panel, the IGDA, the Interactive Audio Special Interest Group, and the Black In Games Special Interest Group for supporting us as well. And thank you so much to our panelists, Chase, Hassan, Jasmine, and Will. Your answers, your honesty, your vulnerability is so much appreciated. And well, it's going to be captured forever. So, don't regret anything.
So, can y'all still hear me? I've been having some technical issues. Okay, yeah.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to add one last final point. I wanted to actually give a shout out to the Composers Diversity Collective. if you look on that website, it's actually really fantastic. It's a directory of composers of color. And what's actually really neat about it is that it lists by ethnicity, location, and language. And I think that the goal of this website is to sort of eliminate the excuse of like, oh, we couldn't find anyone, we couldn't find whatever. But instead, it's like, well, here it is. It's very easily searchable. It's very user friendly, and it's definitely full of some incredibly talented folks. I think Michael Abels is on the board of this organization. He's the composer from Us and Get Out, and it's definitely something to have a look at if you're in a position of hiring and you're looking for composers of color to work with.
Awesome. Thanks, Will. So, Renee, I think we're done. So thank you again, Chase, Hassan, Jasmine, and Will. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your vulnerability. See you all.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you for having me.